Hello, I'm Ray Reed. I'm a museum director at the Montana Military Museum, and what we have in front of us and around us is the exhibit called the Greatest Legislation, the GI Bill. It's the story of the GI Bill. And we'd like to make this available to our public at a wider basis than we have in the past. They travel through here, but some schools and other agencies have not been able to actually see this. So we're going to try to record it today for that purpose.
The American Legion 100th Anniversary Observance Committee selected the GI Bill story as the focus of a traveling multimedia centennial museum display, because it is the organization's marquee legislative accomplishment so far, one that has touched the lives of millions around the world and continues to do so. To understand the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, it helps to reflect on the conditions World War I veterans faced after discharge from military service. Typically, once they returned from making the world safe for democracy in what was supposed to have been the war to end all wars, they were given a train ticket, $60, and the right to wear their uniforms home. There was no Veterans Administration, no coordinated health care service for those who came home disabled or sick from wartime service, no education or job training program, no opportunity to dispute the character of their discharge, no affordable home or business loans to give veterans a chance to catch up in an economy that steamed ahead in their absence while they were in harm's way, fighting with their lives for the freedom of all others and their opportunities. World War I veterans suffering from shell shock, what today we define as post-traumatic stress disorder, were relegated to jails and asylums if they were permitted a roof over their heads at all. Those who came home having lost their eyesight or limbs could be found on street corners selling apples and pencils, begging for coins from the beneficiaries of their sacrifices. The generation of wartime veterans that formed the American Legion worked self-reliantly, advocating on behalf of their comrades and their families to fulfill the sacred pledge Abraham Lincoln made for the nation in 1865, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan. That generation of American Legion founders fought to assist veterans in the pursuit of gainful employment. They lobbied Congress for disability benefits that were scant at the time. They demanded education and career training for those who had served so that they could re-enter the civilian economy qualified to contribute and succeed. They pushed for new veterans' hospitals and mental health services. They did so not only as a matter of morality and healing, as Lincoln suggested, but also in an effort to strengthen the nation by not failing America's veterans in the event the nation should call its sons and daughters to war again. World War II was that call. Some 16 million American men and women would be summoned to military service. They deployed to European and Pacific theaters. More than 400,000 would lose their lives. More than 670,000 were wounded. By October of 1943, some 75,000 medically discharged World War II GIs were returning to their home communities per month. Government services were limited, under-resourced, and inefficient. The plight of disabled veterans became the responsibility of their families, churches, and American Legion posts. Congress was fully aware of the problem and had drafted more than 600 legislative responses. The complex mix of bills and initiatives, however, became entangled over authority and funding questions as America was fighting a world war on two fronts. The American Legion firmly determined that one omnibus bill was needed, a grassroots initiative to protect the World War II generation from the fate many of the World War I veterans had endured. American Legion past National Commander Harry W. Colmery, who is credited as the primary architect of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, put the mission this way: "Never again do we want to see the honor and glory of our nation fade to the extent that her men of arms, with despondent heart and palsied limb, totter from door to door, bowing their souls to the frozen bosom of reluctant charity." Colmery famously drafted the legislation in longhand at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. The act, a GI Bill of Rights, was distilled into 10 key provisions. 1. Educational opportunity. 2. Vocational training. 3. Readjustment compensation. 4. Home and business loans. 5. Discharge review. 6. Adequate hospitalization. 7. Prompt settlement of disability claims. 8. Mustering out pay. 9. Veteran employment services. 10. Concentration of all veteran services under the Veterans Administration. For most of the first half of 1944, the American Legion, supported by the William Randolph Hearst newspaper empire, fought for public understanding, acceptance, and passage of the far-reaching measure. Opponents of the idea feared the GI Bill would break the U.S. Treasury. Some openly complained that by providing free college for veterans, government funds would dry up for those who came home disabled by war. A faction in Congress opposed the GI Bill because it would be offered to all wartime veterans, regardless of their ethnicity. The military fought back against the provision that would offer veterans the opportunity to appeal the character of their discharges. At the time, a veteran had virtually no recourse if his or her discharge was characterized as less than honorable. The American Legion would not waver from its position. The Senate and House both passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, but the whole effort nearly died in a conference committee when legislators were deadlocked in a 3-3 tie over one provision: $20 a week for 52 weeks in readjustment compensation for veterans to help them make ends meet while seeking employment after discharge. The argument against that provision came from legislators who did not want black and white veterans to receive equal compensation. The swing vote, Representative John Gibson, was home in Georgia as the GI Bill stalled in the conference committee. After a week of debate, the lawmakers remained at an impasse. On the Friday evening before the GI Bill's last chance in the conference committee, the American Legion launched a frantic search for Gibson. They reached a dispatcher in Atlanta whose husband had come ashore at Normandy 4 days earlier, on D-Day. She vowed to call the congressman's house every 5 minutes until he answered. Finally, as midnight neared, Gibson answered the phone. The American Legion hastily arranged for an Army driver and police escorts to race Gibson through a thunderstorm from his home in Georgia to Jacksonville, Florida, where a plane was waiting. On the morning of June 10, 1944, Gibson landed in Washington, D.C., went to the conference committee hearing, and threatened the other lawmakers with a press conference to identify the no votes and the reasons why. He cast his vote, and the others unanimously agreed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act on June 22, 1944. Critics who predicted catastrophe were proven wrong. More than 8 million World War II veterans would use their GI Bill education and training benefits, converting a potential economic disaster into an unparalleled success. College enrollment nationwide ballooned from 1.6 million to 2.1 million between 1945 and 1946. By 1947, half of America's college students were military veterans using their GI Bill benefits. And, contradictory to the prediction of critics, Only 14% took full advantage of their one-year unemployment compensation, the 5220 provision that critics argued would be exploited by the veterans and should not be extended to African Americans. VA home loans to veterans represented 512,000 new mortgages in 1947. The housing industry began a boom that would continue for decades. The GI Bill was later estimated to have returned $7 in tax revenue for every federal dollar invested in the nation's veterans. The benefits package for World War II veterans are calculated to have produced 450,000 engineers, 240,000 accountants, 238,000 educators, 91,000 scientists, 67,000 doctors, 22,000 dentists, and tens of thousands more business owners and skilled, educated professionals. America would arise from the Great Depression and a two-front war stronger than ever, a global superpower for decades to come, thanks largely to the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 and the ripple effect it had over the next half-century and beyond. Many of America's most significant social and economic strides of the 20th century were stimulated by the GI Bill. By making home ownership and higher education available to veterans, the GI Bill democratized college attendance and created a prosperous middle class. Banks and higher education institutions responded to the GI Bill's success by working to improve access to school and funding to all Americans, not just those who had served in uniform. The American Legion's intolerance for racial discrimination regarding the GI Bill paved the way for racial equality and the civil rights movement. Ultimately, the GI Bill changed the way the American public perceived veterans. No longer a broken burden to society begging on the streets for charity, but as a proud engine of economic productivity, growth, and national pride. Over the years, although future renditions of the GI Bill were not as generous, the benefit of free college education, affordable home loans, and decent health care became such important incentives to enlist in the military, the United States has operated as an all-volunteer force since 1973. In the final quarter of the 20th century, the GI Bill was often modified to meet the needs of veterans of the time, expanded to those who served during peacetime. By the 8th year of the global war on terrorism, the benefits package had fallen out of step with modern education and the needs of 21st century veterans. The post-9/11 GI Bill, passed by Congress in 2008 and enacted a year later, was a major overhaul that its architect, U.S. Senator James Webb of Virginia, said would strive to have the same value as the 1944 legislation. Among the key features of the new GI Bill was transferability to a spouse or dependent, extending the benefit to family members of those who had chosen to serve the nation in uniform. Later, in 2017, another upgrade came when the Harry W. Colmery Veterans Educational Assistance Act was signed into law, lifting the time cap for veterans to use their benefits. The spirit behind the new benefits package, called the Forever GI Bill, was reflected in the fact that it was named for the American Legion past national commander who designed the original. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 was a breakthrough for veterans and their families. It stimulated over a half-century of American economic prosperity. It gave veterans deserved health care and more timely disability compensation. And it changed the nation's perceptions about military service and veterans in general. One other critical legacy of the bill is that it demonstrated how Americans can identify problems in society, devise solutions, and use the democratic process to enact change. Many Americans, veteran and otherwise, believe the GI Bill was the product of a congressional committee, or VA. Instead, they are astonished to discover that this world-changing set of benefits was born of the people themselves, in this case, the American Legion, who proved they can actively participate in the democracy they swore with their lives to defend and produce results that benefit the entire nation.
If you would like more information on the greatest legislation, the story of the GI Bill, or any other items that the Montana Military Museum produces in its facility at Fort Harrison, Montana, please contact the following number: 406-324-3550, or you may reach us at the website www.montanamilitarymuseum.org. And we have an email address, info@montanamilitarymuseum.org. Please feel free to contact us.